There's a moment in every geopolitical crisis where the noise gets so loud that almost nobody stops to ask the most important question, not what just happened, but who needed it to happen. And right now, as we sit here watching footage of Iranian ballistic missiles streaking across the night sky toward Kuwait, striking territory where American servicemen and women are stationed, I want you to slow down with me. Because what you're being told about this event and what this event actually is are two very different things, and the gap between those two realities, that gap is where the real power lives. I've spent years studying how empires manage their narratives, and I want to tell you something plainly. The Middle East is not descending into chaos. It is being navigated into a very specific configuration, and tonight, Iran firing missiles at the US base in Kuwait is not the beginning of something new. It is the latest visible move in a game that has been quietly, methodically unfolding for the better part of 3 decades. The chessboard was set long before this moment. Most people are just now noticing the board exists. Stay with me, because there's a critical realization buried inside this story. Something about who actually benefits from this escalation that I'm going to fully unpack toward the end of this conversation. And once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. So let's begin where all serious analysis must begin, not with the missiles, but with the architecture of pressure that made those missiles fly. To understand what Iran just did, and more importantly why, you have to understand the corner that Iran has been backed into over the last several years. This is not a nation acting from a position of strength and confidence. This is a nation that has watched its regional partners get systematically dismantled. Hezbollah, which for decades functioned as Iran's most powerful forward deterrent, its most sophisticated external arm, has been devastated. The precision with which Israeli intelligence penetrated Hezbollah's communications, the surgical strikes on its leadership, the degradation of its missile stockpiles, all of that stripped Iran of its most credible conventional threat posture in the Levant. Hamas, meanwhile, is functionally destroyed as a military organization in Gaza. The political infrastructure that Iran had spent 20 years cultivating across the so-called axis of resistance has been visibly, publicly, humiliatingly weakened. And here's where I need you to think like a strategist rather than a news consumer. When a state actor loses its proxies, when its deterrence architecture collapses in real time on the world stage, it faces an existential credibility crisis. Not just militarily, politically, domestically. The leadership in Tehran is not operating in a vacuum. They have a population that is watching. They have hardliners who are watching. They have Revolutionary Guard commanders who are watching. And when you have lost this much face this publicly, the internal pressure to demonstrate that Iran still has teeth, that Iran cannot be defanged without consequence, becomes almost overwhelming. That is the psychological and political environment inside which this missile strike on Kuwait was born. But understanding the internal Iranian pressure only gives you half the picture. The other half requires us to look at Kuwait itself and why that specific geography matters enormously in this moment. Kuwait is not just a small Gulf monarchy with oil wealth. Kuwait is one of the most strategically sensitive territories in the entire Persian Gulf region, precisely because of its proximity to both Iraq and the Iranian border, and because of the significant American military footprint it hosts. Camp Arifjan, the U.S. Army base that has functioned as a critical logistics and command hub for American operations across the Middle East for over 2 decades, sits on Kuwaiti soil. When Iran targets Kuwait, it is not targeting Kuwait. It is sending a direct, unambiguous message to Washington, delivered in the most kinetic language available. We can reach your people, we can reach your infrastructure, and we are willing to do so. But here's where this gets genuinely complicated, and I want you to sit with this question for a moment. If Iran truly wanted to maximize casualties and trigger an immediate full-scale military response from the United States, would it have done this differently? Would the targeting have been more precise? Would the warheads have been more lethal? Because the early reports suggest damage, they suggest disruption, but the picture that's emerging is not one of a strike designed to produce mass American casualties. And that distinction is not an accident. Nothing in Iranian strategic doctrine at this level is an accident. This brings me to something I think about constantly when I watch these escalation cycles play out, which is the concept of what I call calibrated catastrophe. The idea that a military action can be simultaneously real and theatrical, that it can cause genuine damage while also being carefully engineered to stop short of the threshold that triggers a response you're not actually prepared to absorb. Iran is not suicidal. The supreme leadership and the IRGC commanders understand perfectly well that a full American military response, particularly one with Israeli coordination and Gulf state logistical support, would be devastating to Iranian military infrastructure. So the strike on Kuwait is real enough to restore some domestic credibility, dramatic enough to dominate global headlines, but calibrated carefully enough to potentially avoid the worst possible American response. The question now, and this is the question that Washington is wrestling with in real time as we speak, is how the United States responds without either appearing weak or triggering a spiral neither side can control. And to understand the American dilemma here, we have to zoom out and look at the broader strategic context that the Biden to Trump transition created in the region. Because American foreign policy in the Middle East right now is caught between two competing impulses that are very difficult to reconcile. On one hand, there is enormous domestic political pressure to be seen as strong, decisive, and unafraid of Iranian aggression. On the other hand, the Trump administration entered office with at least some stated desire to avoid new land wars in the Middle East, to pursue economic leverage over military leverage, and to reopen some form of diplomatic channel with Tehran on the nuclear question. A major Iranian missile strike on a US base in Kuwait does not make either of those goals easier. It makes both of them significantly harder. This is where I want to introduce a concept that I think is essential to understanding not just this crisis, but the entire structure of Middle Eastern geopolitics, which is the idea of the escalation trap. The escalation trap works like this. One actor takes a step that forces the other actor to choose between an aggressive response that deepens the conflict or a measured response that is read as weakness. And then the cycle continues, with each round making de-escalation progressively more politically costly. America and Iran have been caught in versions of this trap repeatedly over the last 2 decades, from the tanker wars to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani to the retaliatory Iranian strikes on Al-Assad air base in Iraq in 2020. And in every single instance, the world held its breath waiting for the full-scale war that somehow, just barely, didn't come. So the real question isn't whether the United States will respond to the Kuwait strike. It will. The question is whether that response can be engineered to satisfy domestic political audiences without feeding the escalation trap another round of fuel. Now, I want to bring in something that almost nobody in the mainstream commentary is talking about right now, and that is the role of the Gulf Cooperation Council states in this unfolding drama. Because the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait itself, are not passive bystanders in this conflict. They are active participants with their own strategic interests, their own fears, and their own lines of communication to multiple parties simultaneously. Saudi Arabia has spent the last 2 years conducting a quite remarkable diplomatic pivot, normalizing relations with Iran through Chinese mediation, opening channels that were frozen for years. The UAE has been similarly pragmatic, maintaining economic relationships with Tehran, even while hosting American bases and Israeli business partners. These are not countries that want a full-scale American-Iranian war on their doorstep. The economic consequences alone would be catastrophic. The threat to their own infrastructure would be existential. So here's a question I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts on in the comments. Do you believe the Gulf states have sufficient leverage over Washington right now to moderate the American military response? And if so, does that leverage cut both ways? Meaning, could they also be quietly signaling to Tehran that it went too far this time? Because the phone lines between Riyadh and Tehran, between Abu Dhabi and Washington, between Doha and everyone simultaneously given Qatar's unique diplomatic positioning, those lines are burning right now. And the conversations happening on those lines will do more to determine the next 6 weeks in the Middle East than anything you're watching on television. Let me shift now to the energy dimension of this crisis, because I think this is profoundly underappreciated in most of the commentary you'll encounter. Kuwait sits at the northern tip of the Persian Gulf, directly adjacent to the waterways through which a massive percentage of global oil flows. The Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has repeatedly threatened to close in past escalation cycles, is the single most strategically critical maritime choke point on the planet. Roughly 20% of all global oil trade transits through it. When you have Iranian missiles striking Kuwait, when you have the credible possibility of further escalation, the immediate knock-on effect in energy markets is not subtle. Oil prices spike, shipping insurance costs surge, tanker operators reroute or delay, and every single economy that is downstream of Persian Gulf oil exports, which is essentially the entire global economy, absorbs a shock. This matters enormously because it happens against a backdrop of already significant global economic fragility. Central banks are still navigating the aftermath of the most aggressive interest rate cycle in a generation. Sovereign debt loads in the major Western economies are at historic highs. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency is under more sustained structural challenge than at any point since Bretton Woods. And into this already stressed system, you are now injecting a major geopolitical risk premium into energy prices at exactly the wrong moment. The timing, if you think about it carefully, is almost economically diabolical. Which brings me back to that critical realization I mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, the one I said I would fully unpack here. It has to do with the question of who benefits from sustained chaos in the Middle East, and the answer, I promise you, is more counterintuitive and more disturbing than most people are willing to sit with. Here is what decades of studying these crisis cycles has taught me. The actor who benefits most from a prolonged, managed but never quite resolved Middle Eastern crisis is not Iran. Iran suffers under sanctions, economic isolation, and military pressure. It is not the Arab Gulf states. They desperately need stability for their economic diversification projects, for Vision 2030, for the massive infrastructure investments they are trying to attract. It is not even Israel, which absorbs genuine security costs and social trauma from every escalation cycle. The actor that benefits most from a Middle East that is always just unstable enough to require an American military presence, always just dangerous enough to keep oil markets volatile, always just threatening enough to justify enormous defense budgets and weapons sales, is the constellation of interests that former President Eisenhower named with great precision in his farewell address: the military-industrial complex and the financial architecture that surrounds it. I want to be very clear that I'm not suggesting this crisis was engineered in a boardroom somewhere by people in dark suits. The human motivations on every side, Iranian frustration and wounded pride, American political pressures, Israeli security calculations, are all completely real. But there is a structural logic to these conflicts that consistently produces winners and losers, independent of anyone's conscious intentions. And the consistent winners are defense contractors whose order books fill with every new escalation, financial institutions that profit from the volatility, and the political class in Washington that uses foreign threats to maintain domestic power and justify budgets that would otherwise be indefensible to the American taxpayer. What does this mean practically? It means that the incentive structure within the American national security establishment is not actually oriented toward resolving the Iranian problem. It is oriented toward managing it at a level of sustained, profitable tension. Real resolution, whether through a comprehensive nuclear deal, a regional security architecture that gave Iran genuine security guarantees, or a mutual withdrawal of provocative postures, real resolution would be economically and politically costly to too many powerful interests. So instead we get another cycle: provocation, response, near escalation, diplomatic temperature reduction, and then back around again, each cycle leaving the region a little more scarred, a little more militarized, and a little more dependent on American military guarantees. And I want to ask you something directly, because this is where I think the American audience needs to engage most honestly with itself. At what point does the American public develop enough clarity about this structural dynamic to actually demand something different from its political leadership? Because the information is available, the analysis is available, the historical record is very clear about how these cycles work and who they serve. What is missing is not knowledge. What is missing is the willingness to act on that knowledge politically. The signals coming out of the region right now suggest we are in an extremely dangerous transitional moment. Iran's conventional deterrence posture has been severely weakened by the degradation of Hezbollah and Hamas. This means Tehran may feel more pressure, not less, to demonstrate its nuclear potential as its ultimate deterrent, exactly the escalation dynamic that rational non-proliferation theory most feared. Meanwhile, the Israeli government, emboldened by its recent military successes against Hezbollah and feeling the clock ticking on the Iranian nuclear program, may see this moment as an opportunity to push for the decisive confrontation with Iranian nuclear infrastructure that it has wanted for years. And the United States, caught between its stated desire to avoid new wars and its structural inability to appear weak, may find itself dragged step by step into a conflict that serves almost none of the actual interests of the American people. Here is my final thought, and I want you to carry this with you. Every time you see a crisis of this nature explode into your newsfeed, the most important discipline you can practice is to ask not just what happened and who did it, but what structure of incentives made this event more likely than not. Because the Middle East is not chaotic in a random, unpredictable way. It is chaotic in patterns, And those patterns have authors, even if those authors never intended every specific consequence that flows from their choices. The Iranian missile strike on Kuwait is real. The American casualties and the disruption it caused are real. The fear it has generated is real. But the deeper reality is that this event fits into a pattern that has been generating profit and political power for specific interests for a very long time. The question of whether this generation of Americans has the analytical clarity and the political will to finally break that pattern, I genuinely don't know the answer to that. But I believe the capacity is there. And I believe conversations like this one, where we refuse to accept the first narrative we're handed, where we insist on looking at the architecture behind the event, are how that capacity gets built. Tell me in the comments, what do you think the realistic American response to this strike looks like? And do you believe the current administration has both the strategic clarity and the political courage to avoid the escalation trap this time? I read every comment, and this conversation matters more than you might think.